Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this NLA City Dialogue session on resilient cities preparing for climate events in the UK. And of course, as everybody knows, we're in the first week of COP26, but we still don't know if by the end of the negotiations we'll reach an agreement to finally limit global heating to less dangerous levels. And of course, the Times today, I can't focus on that, I don't think on my screen, but it suggests that the COP26 vows could keep global warming below 2 degrees, as it says. Those are the vows which have been taken so far, but there's still a long way to go to 1.5. So what is undeniable, though, is that climate change is already affecting us in the UK. The Committee on Climate Change has been clear about the climate risks that we face. And we at NLA have recently published a report called Resilient London that highlights the importance to look at climate resilience alongside climate mitigation approaches. So just earlier this week, we hosted an event as part of the COP26 UK Built Environment Virtual Pavilion to discuss the role of cities in addressing the climate emergency. And we heard from New York, Singapore, and Nakuru County in Kenya, and all the interesting things that they're doing and showing their key initiatives and how those places are sort of leading the way when it comes to climate action. So today we'll be focusing on UK cities and their commitments, and we're very glad to be joined by Glasgow, Manchester, Birmingham and London for this City Dialogue. But before we start, I'd just like to thank our City Dialogue champions, who are ACOM, KPF and UNI, and our net zero champions, Argent related and civic engineers, along with Elementa, Hein Tillett Steel, Hawley, Hydro by Wincona, London and Partners, and the Waterman Group. So I just remind everyone that there will be time to ask some questions to our speakers at the end, so do post them in the Q&A chat and we will get to them later on. But to start us off, I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dave Cheshire, and he's Sustainability Director at ACOM, and he's going to give us an overview of the climate risks that UK cities face today. So Dave, over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Peter. Yes, I would like to talk a bit about how we make resilient but also regenerative cities, because I think this is where we should be going in the future. So, I mean, we are having to plunder the world's resources at a phenomenal rate at the moment, and digging out all that material that we need to build our cities and to make our buildings and to keep them going, really. A recent UN report was saying that 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with winning resources and those same activities are also creating 90% of biodiversity loss, which is phenomenal. And actually what we're reaching is a tipping point now where we are, the Amazon rainforest, for example, is now no longer a sink for carbon dioxide. It's actually releasing more carbon dioxide than it is storing, which is truly scary, I think. Next slide, please. So, and I think at the other end of the scale, we have huge volumes of waste and resources being wasted out of our cities. The construction industry alone is generating more waste than any other waste stream in most countries in the world. And never mind the black bag waste and all the other waste that's being generated. But also, you know, we've got raw sewage coming out of our cities, and unfortunately in the UK, a lot of that's being dumped in the rivers, as we're seeing in the news, and then we've got, if anyone's having a cup of tea with this, they're probably drinking, or we are drinking microplastics now and ingesting those, just because when we're throwing away stuff, there really is no way it comes back to us. Next slide, please. And so where we could be going, and I think where the future is actually to say, rather than try and mitigate and reduce the impacts that we're having on the planet, use a little bit less energy, use a little bit less materials. I think it's time now really to move to the other end of the scale, whereas, what can we do? And this is the challenge. Can we create a regenerative city and a regenerative buildings that are actually giving back to the environment more than they're taking? Can we make cities part of the ecosystem? And I know that sounds crazy, but let me give you some examples. So next slide, please. So, I think a big part of this is building in and restoring green and blue infrastructure into our cities. So this is an extract from our London 2070 report that came out a few weeks ago, saying, we've got all these hidden rivers, we've got all this blue infrastructure that we could be taking a lot more advantage of. And next slide, please. And how could we make cities that are more like sponges? So when we have these intense rainfall events and we have these flooding events, can we then can we use that infrastructure to help absorb that and mitigate the worst of those impacts? Next slide, please. And I think, in that report we sort of set out, obviously the flood risk is a massive issue, but also lots of other massive impacts that our cities are having, both on the planet and the planet. London is and other cities are suffering, and these intense heat effects are another one. And I think the green and blue infrastructure is something that will help with that by reducing creating shading on the streets and using the evapotranspiration effect to reduce heat gains, along with really we're having to think about and redesign how our buildings, and putting shutters on the outside of our homes is something we've never done, but actually maybe that's something we have to adopt in the future. Next slide, please. And I think this, and I love this slide of this image of the New York High Line, which I'm sure everyone knows about, where they've used a redundant infrastructure to plant lots of green infrastructure and provide lots of biodiversity. And there's lots of research they're doing on it at the moment in terms of well-being, but also in terms of pollinators being repopulating these areas. And imagine if we could turn all that concrete and stuff we've got in the Barbican and the South Bank in London. Imagine if we could turn that into green, a green humming environment. And a couple of other examples worth mentioning, and Stockton-on-Tees are now proposing to knock down their brutalist shopping centre and build park and green infrastructure, which I think is never seen anything like that. We're actually taking away buildings and putting in parks. Maybe that's the future for us. And another one which I really love is in the Costa Rica suburb dubbed Sweet City, where they have made all the every species has citizen rights equal to humans. So, and they've got pollinators, and everything from pollinators to trees to everything is given rights so that they are protected, and that's transformed that local environment. Next slide, please. And then we're seeing, I'm starting to see now that where we're building in infrastructure to be able to grow plants in cities and grow our own food. And I think that's by integrating greenhouses and things into roofs or into the buildings. And there's a couple of examples of that. And of course, it's very symbiotic, because actually you can take the waste, warm, moist air from our buildings and use that to and hopefully not, but slightly CO2 laden air, which is perfect for growing conditions for plants. And then there's some work we've been doing in New York to look at whether we can actually use plants as well to clean up the air and through phytoremediation. Next slide, please. And I think something I've been doing a lot of work on, we have in AECOM now, is looking at the circular economy and how that can apply to buildings. And this idea that we've got all this resource in our cities now. We've got millions and millions of tons of of materials that is effectively a stock. So firstly, can we retain and reclaim existing buildings rather than demolishing and building new where we can? And then when we are building, can we actually use that stock of resources rather than downcycling everything and smashing everything and crushing everything? Can we reclaim bits and reuse that? And this whole sort of idea could work for water and all sorts of other resources, that you radically reduce the amount of raw materials that you need, you radically reduce the amount of waste that you're producing, and then you become a lot more circular and holistic. Next slide, please. And then in terms of energy, the Bullet Centre is a great example of a building in a city that is generating more energy than it needs over a year. And the UAL library on the right there is a project that AECOM designed that has a photovoltaic array across the entire roof. So again, generating lots of energy and actually driving down the demand for energy in the building so that you start to get closer to matching the two up. Next slide, please. And I think what's really exciting and again very different is this idea that we could be capturing carbon in our materials and in our buildings that we use. So this is an insulation product grown from using mycelium that captures and stores carbon as it grows, and then when it's completed it then goes into buildings as very high performance insulation. So what we could be doing, imagine if we could be actually sequestering carbon into our cities rather than being a net emitter of carbon. Next slide, please. And how does this all fit together? Well, we've does this fantastic project that we're doing with the SAO architects. It's a multidisciplinary project where AECOM is providing cost consultancy, building services, structural engineering, and sustainability. And we looked at a concept idea where we could be taking a lot of the ideas I've just talked about rooftop greenhouses, about urban farming, using composting to compost and provide soil for the plants, to have multi-generational living, green and blue infrastructure, as well as all the usual stuff around energy and water and capturing every drop of rain. I mean, we've got fresh water coming out of the skies that we just put straight onto hard landscaping and straight down the drains. I mean, and then we're taking up this huge infrastructure across the country to clean up water, and most of it we flush down the toilet. It's crazy. We need to completely rethink this. Next slide, please. And then finally, just to say, on Meridian Water, we've now focused down on one building, and at a concept design level, we're looking at how we can apply the circular economy in a really practical way. So this is a very adaptable building design with intermediate floors that you can take out if you want to raise floor to ceiling heights, designed completely around disassembly with some specific types of connections. We're taking reclaimed steel from a donor building, and we're using local manufacturing to build this kit of parts that will then become a new product that we can use. So there are practical examples of this, and this is how we can do it. Next slide, please. So just leave you with this idea that really, in my view, that we've been doing this incremental change over all this time and gradually trying to reduce our inputs, improve things. I don't think that's going to work any longer. I think we've got to set out where we want to be, set out a vision for the future, and then work out how we're going to get there. And as Buckminster Fuller says, if we want to change it, then we need to set out this new model and then make what we're doing currently look obsolete. Thank you for your attention. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dave. And it's been really amazing. How many people have quoted Buckminster Fuller over the last few days since the COP discussion started? So insightful, and I think he would have really liked your message. I think regenerative cities is a great message. So thank you very much for that. And now we're going to hear from Manchester. And we've got Sam Evans, who's Head of Natural Environment at Greater Manchester Combined Authority, here to present to us. So Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good morning, everyone. Great to be here this morning to give you a bit of perspective from Greater Manchester, and really building on some of what Dave was talking about there, particularly around sponge cities, green and blue infrastructure, and how we go from some of those exemplar projects to scaling that up. And I wanted to pick up on one of the key elements of the report we're here to discuss today, particularly around investment and financing, how we make some of this happen and bring in other investment to do that, and share some experience from Greater Manchester in how we're going about doing that. So next slide, please. I think, Peter, you summed up this really well at the start. You know, we're facing significant risks associated with the climate crisis, and we've baked in impacts of that no matter what our efforts and what comes out of COP on mitigation. We know we've baked in serious, significant risks associated with climate change, and we know that that is also bound up with a biodiversity emergency. Nature is in crisis as well, but we know that nature can help us adapt to climate change, and nature-based solutions are going to be particularly important in helping tackle the biodiversity emergency and the climate emergency. But funding and investment in nature and adaptation and resilience remains low and driven by public investment, and that's what I'm going to talk about over the next 10 minutes, is how our work in Greater Manchester is seeking to change that. Next slide, please. So like other cities that we'll hear from, we're particularly facing risks in Greater Manchester of surface water flooding along with overheating. And some of those issues that Dave described of water running off hard surfaces straight into drains and causing issues and strains on our sewer network and on our hard surfaces. As well as those kind of physical risks, there are other factors contributing to our lack of action to tackle those. So responsibilities, opportunities sit across multiple organisations, local authorities, environment agency, water utilities, others and landowners. Public funding to tackle that is relatively limited at the moment. And as far as nature-based solutions are concerned, we know that they are good things, but translating, and we've seen some of the exemplar projects that Dave highlighted, but how do you translate those into accepting the benefits that they provide and organisations wanting to invest in those and being able to get a return on those? Next slide, please. I talked about the kind of value of our natural environment. Some of the work that we've done in Greater Manchester in developing natural capital accounts has been really important in demonstrating that value at a political, strategic level. So this is natural capital accounting as a way of understanding the value of your natural environment for a particular city region. In this case, it can be down to a local authority level, it can be done down to site and development level. And it's a way of understanding and communicating the value of the natural assets, the green spaces, the blue spaces of a particular area. And in Greater Manchester, our natural capital accounts show that we get £1 billion worth of benefits each and every year from our natural environment, from our green spaces, from our rivers and streams, from our canals. We get £264 million worth of mental health benefits a year. We get recreational benefits. We get climate regulation benefits. And this has been really important for us in Greater Manchester of making the case for the value of the natural environment and the role it can play in tackling all of these issues we face in urban areas, but particularly in tackling the risks associated with a changing climate. Next slide, please. And in Greater Manchester, we've been working to try and translate that understanding of the benefits. So we get that the natural environment provides all of these benefits into the next question, I guess, which is how do we translate that understanding, that acceptance of the benefits into wanting to see more of those benefits, organisations wanting to invest to see more of those benefits. And a couple of years ago, we commissioned and published a natural capital investment plan for Greater Manchester, which really helped us prioritise where we should be focusing our efforts within Greater Manchester. What challenges are we facing? What opportunities are there to attract private investment alongside public funding into improving our natural environment so we get more of those benefits that I showed you on the previous slide. We get more water not running off surfaces into our drains. We get more biodiversity, we get more carbon locked away. So what are the opportunities for doing that, but also getting other sources of investment to go in to make that happen? So that was really important for us in understanding our priorities and opportunities. Next slide, please. And this is kind of the challenge we're facing really in natural capital investment in our natural environment. We're kind of stuck over to the left-hand side of this diagram where most funding into our green spaces, into habitat management, is to the left of the dotted line here. It's mostly grant funding from government, trusts, foundations, lottery funds, which have been really important in making improvements, but obviously is limited in terms of the amount of funding that can bring in. And what we're seeking to do through the Natural Capital Investment Plan in our work is shift beyond that dotted line and move along that journey to initially more blended finance, so bringing in private finance alongside public investment, and hopefully over the coming years moving to the right-hand side of this diagram, where investment in the natural environment just becomes a mainstream investment like anything else. So that's where we're trying to move the market, and that will take time, but that's what we're trying to do and support within Greater Manchester. Next slide, please. And why are we stuck on the left of that diagram? Well, there's barriers between investors and the supply of capital out there and natural capital projects, so projects that would deliver some of those benefits on the ground. We know there's lots of demand from our NGOs, from others to actually make this happen, but we need to bridge that gap that's caused by a lack of business cases, a lack of pipelines of projects at the right sort of scale, and often individual small projects that need to be brought together to be delivered and contracted for. And those are just some of the barriers that are stopping that kind of mainstreaming of investment into the natural environment. And we're working to try and overcome and bridge that gap there in the hourglass in our work. And I'll come on now on the next slide, please, to work we're doing within the Ignition project within Greater Manchester, which I talk about, to move on this journey, which is the steps we're trying to go through to get to a point where we can attract investment into the natural environment. So proving that nature-based solutions can deliver, proving that they can generate cash flows and there's demand there for the services that they can provide, raising investment, and then towards the right of here, attracting in the first instance patient capital before scaling up investment, hopefully into our natural environment in the future. And if you go on to the next slide, please, there's work that we are doing through a project called Ignition within Greater Manchester, that we're trying to move through those phases in terms of nature-based solutions in our urban areas. So sustainable drainage systems, green walls, green roofs. We're trying to move through those steps of understanding their benefits, understanding what demand there is out there for those benefits from our water companies, from local authorities, from others, so that we can scale them up. And you can see some of the demonstrator projects that we've put in place through the Ignition project. We've got at the University of Salford an interconnected green wall, green roof, rain garden, all interconnected, all managing water on the site, and all being monitored to the nth degree, really, to understand the benefits they are generating for energy savings on the building, for water managed on the campus, for the experience of the students and the attractiveness of those areas. And our challenge really is to say, how do we take all that information, how do we take all that data and make the case to scale these up and develop business models that would allow investment into those, so we can see more of them across Greater Manchester. As Dave was saying, that's the challenge. We know how to do it. There's demonstrators, but how do we actually make this happen at scale? And we're trying to develop business models to allow investment on the back of this work. Our first of those is on the next slide, just to give you a bit of an insight into the work that we're doing. If you go on to the next slide, please. We're trying to use our water companies, the way our water company charges for surface water management on non-domestic properties, where it incentivizes and has an incentive on its charges if you can install sustainable drainage systems on those sites, so that if you did that on enough suitable sites, you could allow those sites to drop in terms of the charges and the bills they pay to the water company. And if you aggregated that over enough years, you potentially then have a saving, a revenue stream that you could use to cover the upfront cost of SUDs and their maintenance. So that was the theory at the start of the project, as to potentially an opportunity for installing SUDs, rain gardens at a number of sites that could do this. But if you go on to the next slide, it's proved more complicated than this. As I won't go into detail the diagram on the right, but through our learning on this, we've kind of understood that it is complicated to get investment into nature-based solutions. There's an ongoing need for public funding alongside private funding. We need to find ways of incentivizing landowners. So what share of those savings could they benefit from? And we need markets for the wider benefits generated by nature-based solutions. So while there's a value to the water company, less water going into their their sewers, and they can start to put a monetary value on that. It's harder to put monetary values on the other benefits around health, around recreation, around amenity, and who pays for those if it's not going to be publicly funded. So we're coming to a much more complicated way of delivering investment in SUDs across a number of sites in Greater Manchester, through contributions from different types of investors, from our water company, from public sector beneficiaries, and hopefully from philanthropic and impact investors to stimulate the market getting going in this area. So it's more complicated, I think, is the message than it first seemed. And finally, if you just go to my final slide, this is just one aspect of what we want to do with our natural environment in Greater Manchester. There are other challenges we have here. We have lowland and upland peatlands that have been degraded, but also provide opportunities for biodiversity and carbon improvements. And we've set up recently a Greater Manchester Environment Fund, I think the UK's first local environmental impact investment fund, that's already brought in over £2 million of funding to put into habitat restoration and generation across Greater Manchester. And our ambition is that will provide really the basis, the foundation for attracting more investment in the future, be that grant funding from government and bringing that in at scale, or be that investment from developers, from others who want to offset their environmental impacts. So we can using the Greater Manchester Environment Fund as the governance, the structure, the opportunity to really channel more investment into delivering our projects and also helping develop the future projects that we know we need to deliver to meet our climate and resilience and adaptation ambitions. So hopefully that's provided you a bit of an insight of what we're doing in Greater Manchester and some of the work we're doing, particularly on the investment in nature-based solutions side of things. So with that, Peter, I'll hand back to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sam. Yes, I was getting very excited about your SUDS funding solutions, because, of course, in London, we're now building a huge tunnel under the Thames, which is basically because the way the assets of the delivery company are worked, that actually it makes sense for them to invest in that, whereas investing in SUDS was incredibly complicated, and there was no financial way of doing it, at least in the timescale we need to have it. So really interested in that, and so I look forward to more discussion about that in question time. But now we're going to move to Birmingham, which of course is doing great work in taming the cars, supersized low traffic neighbourhoods and so on now, changing some of the terrible planning which was put in the 1960s and 70s. And so I'm very glad to introduce Maria Dunn, who's Head of Development Policy, Planning and Development and Inclusive Growth at Birmingham City Council. Maria.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Maria Dunn, Head of Development Policy at Birmingham City Council, primarily responsible for planning policy, but also currently leading on our Route to Zero programme. So this morning, I'm just going to give you some details of the journey we've been on since we declared a climate emergency, some information about our action plan, and highlight some of our successes to date as we go through. Next slide, please. So Birmingham declared a climate emergency in June 2019, and the City Council made a new council priority at that time, which will be Birmingham will be a city that takes a leading role in tackling climate change. On the back of that, we introduced some early actions, which were projects which we could quite quickly mobilise to start to look at reducing the council's carbon emissions. And a lot of those were around things that we were already doing. So a lot of our transport work, looking at how we could encourage people to shift modes from the private car, and look at how we operate as a council and how we can reduce our carbon emissions. And of course, that was before COVID. So things were very different then in terms of how we operated. We commissioned consultants and thesis to prepare a report to look at our carbon baseline and how we could reduce our carbon emissions. And we took an interim report to full council in September 2020. And that set out the output from our thesis. And then we worked that up into an action plan, which we reported to full council in January 2021. And we've got a commitment to go back to full council annually in January of each year, outlining our progress. So in terms of the action plan, it focuses, sorry, next slide please, it focuses on a number of key areas. So the first key area is new build housing. Birmingham has its own housing trust, so builds its own social housing, and the Birmingham Municipal Housing Trust are looking at how to increase their specification. So new housing is already being built to EPC standard B as a minimum, but we're undertaking a passive house trial. We have a site identified and we're working up to submitting a planning application hopefully very soon now, and that will take a site and build it out to passive house standard. And the idea of that is to have a look to see how much extra that costs compared to our current specification, and what we can learn from that in terms of improving the specification for future Birmingham Municipal Housing Trust buildings. In sort of parallel to that, we have an objective to raise the standards of all new homes. So the Birmingham Development Plan, together with the soon to be adopted Development Management Policies in Birmingham Development Plan document, which, apologies, is a bit of a mouthful, sets out our planning policies for new development within the city. Birmingham Development Plan was adopted in January 2017, and those of you who are aware of the plan making system will be aware that the policies were drafted some time before that and had a lengthy ride through the examination system. So those policies now are in need of review. We're reviewing the whole of the Birmingham Development Plan, and work started on that evidence gathering. But the Birmingham Development Plan will really, the review will really have Route to Zero at its heart and our climate change commitment. So we're really looking to go across our whole suite of planning policies, going beyond just renewable energy requirements and carbon from new buildings to look at everything that we do and to look at how we can really green the city. And in parallel with that, we have what we've called our Future City Plan. So for those of you who've heard of the Birmingham Big City Plan, that was the previous iteration, and it essentially is a framework and an aspirational guide for the development of the city centre. And our Future City Plan very much has green living at its heart. So that's everything, all aspects of climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. And it's got a real focus on greening the city in the physical sense, looking at how far we can go in terms of introducing new parks to the city, looking at what we can do around our rail corridors, and also looking at whether we can start to introduce much more as standard things like green walls and green roofs to new buildings. So very much an aspiration to green the city. We are also preparing a design guide SPD, which is due to be adopted hopefully early next year. And that again will set out some more detailed guidance on designing design quality more generally, but also in response to the climate emergency. Next slide, please. So we've also got a substantial housing stock of our own. So we've got a stock of around 60,000 dwellings. We're looking at how we retrofit that housing stock. We've got a number of sort of pilot projects in early stages, projects that are designed and we're looking to seek funding for. We've got bids to a couple of decarbonisation funds, and a project which we're looking at which could start to be a catalyst for the wider retrofit of housing stock across the area, starting with our own housing stock, but also rippling out into the private sector, particularly the able to pay market and influencing that. We've also got East Birmingham Community Heat Task Force. So this is a real focus on the East Birmingham area where Tidely Energy Park's located, and looking at if we can start to focus on that area and use it as a pilot and an exemplar for housing retrofit and low carbon technologies. So the business case for East Birmingham has been approved and work's ongoing now to look at how we take that forward to implementation. Next slide, please. As Peter mentioned in the introduction, we have a lot of work going on around transport. So the Birmingham Transport Plan went out to consultation in January 2020. Obviously, you'll all be aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on how much we travel and how we travel. In response to that, we had the Birmingham Emergency Transport Plan, and the the transport plan itself was put on hold. The emergency transport plan and the measures that the government brought in allowed us to be quite experimental with some of our schemes. So we had a real focus on walking and cycling, making space for social distancing, and we had pop-up cycle lanes. It's fair to say that some of those schemes haven't been a success, but it allowed us to, rather than consult on schemes and talk about what might happen, it allowed us to just implement schemes and see what did happen, and then to change or to remove the ones that weren't successful, but also to make the ones that were successful much more permanent. And we've had really positive feedback from business improvement districts within the city, where we've made space for outdoor seating and made the pedestrian environment much bigger in terms of the space allocated to it and better. And that's allowed us as well to bring in some additional greening to the city centre. So longer term, we've now adopted the transport plan, and longer term we have an aspiration to carve the city centre up into segments, which will really push modal shift. It will make it very difficult to drive. Basically, to drive around the city, you'd have to go into one segment, and if you wanted to go to another segment, you'd have to come back out and around the ring road. So that really will push modal shift, and it will allow us to make the changes that will make those other modes of transport much more attractive in the city centre. So we've got e-scooters, we've got cycle hire scheme, we've got e-bikes going into the cycle hire scheme now as well to facilitate those longer journeys, or those people who feel less able to use a more traditional bike. And we've got a rollout of EV charging points. So we're rolling out 394 EV charging points across the city that are fast and rapid. And then we've got a strategy to look at longer term to 2030 and how many EV charging points we need. We've also got a project to introduce hydrogen buses to the city. So this is about the City Council really acting as a catalyst for that market, facilitating 20 hydrogen buses initially, but looking to expand upon that. And those hydrogen buses are expected to hit the roads with passengers on them later this year. And we've got e-cargo bikes. So this is a small scheme, but it's basically looking at whether we can use bikes, cargo bikes, to reduce reliance on things like white vans within the city centre. And sorry, lastly, the clean air zone, which I'm sure you might have all come across. The clean air zone effectively was implemented to reduce NOx emissions within the city centre, but we are seeing results in terms of reduced vehicle traffic and people starting to think differently about how they travel into the city centre. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we've got work going on around waste. We have a municipal waste strategy being undertaken. We do have an energy from waste plant at Tyseley, but we're moving to look at all sources of waste and not just household, and we're commissioning a total waste strategy to look at all of our waste movements across the city and what our future needs are. And we're also looking to trial alternative fuel vehicles within our waste fleet. And we're speaking to our combined authority about linking up with their work on the circular economy and also looking at wider waste movements across the whole region. Next slide, please. So we have work ongoing around energy. We have a regional energy strategy for the West Midlands, and we've got an energy innovation zone at Tyseley, and the hydrogen buses will be refuelled at Tyseley. So we're quite unique in that we're the only it's the only scheme where the hydrogen is made locally, so there's no loss of fuel to transport. And then we're part of the BEIS decarbonisation of heat programme, so that's developing business cases to look at how we can decarbonise public sector buildings within our within our city. Thank you. Next slide, please. And then lastly, the natural environment is a real strong theme in our climate change action plan. So Birmingham is often quoted as one of Britain's greenest cities. Over a fifth of the area is green space. We have a programme called the Future Parks Accelerator, which is also referred to as Naturally Birmingham, and that's really about looking at the governance of green space and how we make sure that the green spaces within the city have a long-term stable future, and their use is maximised and those spaces are valued and are brought up to high quality, so that we have I would say a few standout green spaces within the city, but also We have some spaces that are perhaps underused. So the Future Parks Accelerator is really looking at how we maximise the use of that green space and make sure that everyone has good quality access. We have a tree policy review, which was undertaken in 2018, and the changes are being implemented to that. And we have a new policy in the Development Management Policies Development Plan document, which changes the way that we look at how trees are valued, and the compensation that developers would need to, the compensatory measures that developers would need to take if they do have to remove trees. So that policy will start to be implemented from early next year. As I've mentioned, the Design Guide SPD, that also includes more detailed information on trees. And we're looking overall at raising the canopy cover to 25% across all wards in the city. So at the moment, we have some wards that have much more than 25% canopy cover, but we also have some that have significantly less. So trying to even out that, not even out that, sorry, because that implies that we might be taking trees down in areas that have more trees than more than 25%. But trying to raise the standard to at least 25% across all of our wards. But that will be challenging in areas where we have predominantly terraced houses and narrower streets. But contributing to that, we have the Commonwealth Games and the tree planting scheme that's coming on the back of that. So that's identifying sites, not just in Birmingham, but across the wider region to host tree planting. And then we have the Coal Valley route, which is a real focus for the green agenda, walking, cycling, sustainable travel, and also biodiversity improvements in that corridor. Next slide, please. So in terms of what the council are doing, we're obviously looking at our own carbon emissions and how we reduce those. We're looking at significantly increasing the resources around Route to Zero. At the moment, we don't have a dedicated team. We are in the process of setting up a dedicated team. We have an assistant director starting with us fully in the new year, and we'll be creating a team around that to really look at ramping up the activity from the current action plan to a much broader range of activity, including a programme of behavioural change. Our new ways of working programme is about how the council works. So on the back of the pandemic, obviously, our working habits have changed significantly. We have very few people still going into the office regularly. A lot of people are preferring to work from home or are still working from home and just going out on site into meetings where we need to. So the new ways of working programme is really looking at how we work and how we reduce the need to travel by being much more agile. So that might be about being based at home, but it might also be about being based in different remote locations between meetings to reduce that need to travel. And on the back of that as well, we'll have the potential to cut our estate and therefore reduce our carbon emissions. We have an extensive programme of partnership working. So our climate change net zero target is a citywide target, not just a city council target. So working with a range of partners across the city, and we expect that partnership working to increase significantly once the team are established. And then embedding net zero across the whole council. So the two main initiatives that we have here are a programme of training that will be rolled out to all of our staff, regardless of what service area they work in, to raise awareness of carbon emissions and how to reduce them both at home and in the workplace. And a system of environmental and sustainability assessment for all of our key decisions. So we'll be looking at all of our decision making reports, including a reference to the sustainability impacts, including carbon emissions, and that will be hopefully bringing that to the forefront of members and senior officers' attention when they're making decisions. And even if we don't always make the decision that reduces carbon the most, we at least will be able to justify the choices that we've made and show that we've considered the carbon emissions in all of our decision making. Next slide, please. So in terms of the next steps, we've got the ongoing delivery of the action plan. We'll be taking an annual report to full council outlining progress, and then we'll be building a wider portfolio of projects once that team's established next year. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Maria. I really like your thinking around the sectors for transport in the city, which is something that Dutch do so well, and you don't often see in UK cities. So that's really interesting. And now we move up to Glasgow, and we're very glad to have Sonia Milne, Sustainability Officer at Glasgow City Council here, because it must be a very busy time for you, Sonia. So thank you very much for joining us today, and tell us about what Glasgow's doing.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us. So today I would like to share with you a brief journey that Glasgow has been on in terms of our net zero carbon by 2030, but also our race to resilience and where we've started in both our journeys, where we are and how we're doing. So next slide, please. So we started around 2010 with the Sustainable Glasgow report, which was produced in collaboration with the University of Strathclyde. And it was a report that set out how the city should achieve its 30% carbon reduction target by 2020 from a baseline of 2006. This included 33 actions and predicted that this would cost the city around £1 billion. Next slide, please. As a result of the report and setting up the Sustainable Glasgow Partnership, which was a public and private sector partnership in the city, we signed up to the Covenant of Mayors at the time and set out to develop our Sustainable Energy Action Plan. In the meantime, Glasgow joined a European funded project, Step Up, as you can see here, and that helped to further enhance the CAP and to benefit from more sophisticated modelling with other European cities. We retained the target of 30% by 2020 and the actions, albeit with a bit more sophisticated data to back that up. Next slide, please. So how did we do in terms of our 2020 target? We have achieved our target, as you can see here, ahead of schedule. So we are now at 41% reduction, and you will see on the screen we've achieved that around 2009, just before. Next slide, please. This won't be new to the other cities on this call either. So we've seen quite a significant reduction in the electricity sector, but our transport sector remains stubbornly at similar levels from 2010. And you will see that gas has seen a gradual reduction, but not as significant as we would like. So these are the two main challenges for us going forward. Next slide, please. So how did we hit our targets? So there was a combination of investment on our school estate in terms of renewables, our housing estate, energy, community energy companies. We have a waste to energy plant, which has come live in the last 4 years, and it diverts an estimated 200,000 tonnes of waste from landfill every year. But also the energy produced by that waste helps us to power 22,000 houses in the neighbourhood of Palmedy in the south side of the city. Next, this last photo is an illustration of investment in our school estate, and that all or most schools have had solar PVs installed in their roofs. And active travel as part of our Avenues programme, both looking at reducing carbon emissions, but also helping to mitigate against flooding and water attenuation. This slide lastly is to illustrate that the city have invested with funding from UK and Scottish government on rolling out a programme of EV charging points in the city, and this illustrates the spaces for people both associated with the Avenues programme, but also as a response to the pandemic, and creating more spaces for walking, cycling and wheeling, while also having rain gardens in the city to help with flood prevention. So in summary, we worked with our own estate and having a demand-side management system to reduce our energy consumption, but we also worked with the University of Strathclyde to look at retrofitting insulation in our existing buildings, and we're currently monitoring those interventions and to understand better the energy and carbon savings from that, and we hope that that will inform future interventions. You'll see on the left here that we've also developed a web portal where we mapped out opportunities for renewable energy, both looking at solar PV mostly, but also looking at vacant and derelict land, of which the city has a lot of, and we probably share that with some of the cities on the call as well. But it just makes things easier for community energy cooperatives or private sector companies who might want to invest in renewable energy, and that the sites have been assessed, and they'll be able to very quickly understand which sites are feasible and which ones are not. And lately here, we have also created a web portal for citizens to access companies that provide services in terms of retrofitting and are accredited to do so. Next slide, please. We also benefited from innovative projects funded by Horizon 2020, and Ruggedized, which you see on the screen, is one of them. And the city is set to invest in renewable and test pilot renewable energy technologies, and creating a smart street, which will be included in our carbon neutral innovation district. But we're also involved in the Connecting Nature, which is again a Horizon 2020 project which looks at nature-based solutions and making a business case for those, as we heard from Manchester, both to address carbon reduction, but also looking at how that builds our resilience to the impacts of climate change, which in Glasgow is flooding, which we are all too familiar with, but also heat, which we're not as prepared for. Next slide, please. So we've heard about our journey up to 2020, and now looking over to 2030, Glasgow City Council, as have other local authorities in the UK, declared a climate and ecological emergency in 2019, and created an ecological emergency working group. The group recommended that the city took a number of actions to address the ecological and climate emergencies, with a target to achieve net zero carbon by 2030 at the heart of that plan. These recommendations have been translated into our climate plan, which was published this summer, and it's framed around the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as you can see here on the screen, with partnership to achieve the 2030 agenda at the heart of it. Next slide, please. We also saw the relaunch of the Sustainable Glasgow Partnership to help us deliver on our 2030 ambitions to both reduce carbon emissions, achieve that net zero target, but also address the ecological and biodiversity decline in the city, and look to achieve that resilience. The partnership has 4 thematic hubs, and they've been meeting monthly and discussing and making plans for investing in action to support that journey to net zero. Next slide, please. Some of the supporting plans and policies that the City Council have will also support the delivery of our ambitions for 2030. We'll see them here, the open space strategy being a key one, a circular economy roadmap, and of course our development plan, which is a delivery mechanism for a lot of these actions. Next slide, please. One of those key plans that will help deliver, especially on that net zero target for 2030, is our local heat and energy strategy, and you can see here that it really is an evolution of our Sustainable Glasgow report, which kick-started our race to net zero, I suppose, all those 11 years ago. But it's combining that with our affordable warmth programme, our local housing strategy, and our energy and carbon master plan. So the next iteration of the plan will be our local heat and energy efficiency strategy. Next slide, please. which will have 5 key areas for action policy themes. So sustainable transport being a key one, energy efficiency, low carbon and heating, renewable energy, and resource efficiency. And this is a citywide plan, which will have various delivery mechanisms, as you can see here, but the development plan and associated guidance being a key means to implement this, as will be the active travel strategy, which we're currently consulting on, and our transport strategy, which we will adopt in 2022. Next slide, please. And our climate plan, as I referred to earlier as well, excuse me, is a plan that's citywide and takes an iterative approach of learning by doing. It has, next slide, please. It is framed around the UN SDGs, as I mentioned earlier, and it sets out 60 actions across 5 key themes. Next slide, please. It lists a number of milestones, such as developing a net zero feasibility study in partnership with the Energy Systems Catapult, but also developing our urban woodland strategy for the city, supporting our Clyde climate forest, and looking at continuing to invest in our education estate, and including the principles of biodiversity net gain in our community planning partnership decision making. Next slide, please. Another milestone within the plan is to develop a more dynamic communication strategy and having behaviour change at the heart of it, to encourage and empower our communities to better take action. In summary, moving forward to the net zero target by 2030, and the climate plan looks to deliver a technical net zero feasibility study. It looks to help deliver our Green Deal for Glasgow and how we can fund that action, building on that public sector ambition and bridging the gap to attract some private sector investment, finalising and publishing our low heat and energy strategy, and planning an investment in retrofitting our housing estate. And finally, looking at working in partnership with our Sustainable Glasgow partners, but also international networks such as the Cities Alliance and C40, and importantly, the development of our climate neutral and innovation district. A key means to deliver all of these actions, next slide please, is, as I've mentioned before, our Sustainable Glasgow partnership. They've recently launched their new website, and the partnership really sets out to make the city one of the most sustainable in Europe. It's a big ambition. I suppose we're not short of ambition in Glasgow, we're short of funding as are other cities, and we hope that this partnership will help us to bridge some of that gap. And the Sustainable Glasgow Charter is a means of doing that. It's been published this year, and we hope that all partners and all organisations in the city will sign it and make a pledge as to how they are going to support that net zero target by 2030. Next slide, please. And in terms of climate resilience, our journey so far is sort of lagging behind the net zero carbon race, and as the Committee on Climate Change have said, earlier this year, it seems to be the Cinderella of climate action, but it's catching up. So in 2016, Glasgow published their climate resilience strategy, Resilient Glasgow, as part of our membership of the Rockefeller Foundation 100 Resilient Cities, and it focused on 3 main areas, with Resilient Place being the most relevant one for climate adaptation. But in the meantime, we have also we are founding members of Climate Ready Clyde, which most of you will maybe have heard of. Climate Ready Clyde is a regional partnership looking at transformational adaptation for Glasgow and the city region. They have published a very comprehensive risk and vulnerability assessment for the city, including economic risks and an economic case for investing on adaptation. Next slide, please. So currently, what's next? So next, we hope to contribute to the Climate Ready Clyde ambitions and the recently developed and published regional adaptation strategy, looking at transformational adaptation for the city region based on a systems innovation approach, we are hoping that we, at the city level, will help with the practical delivery of those actions in the strategy, but also looking at our own risks and looking at the UK climate risk assessment, what they mean for the city, and building that capacity locally using the Glasgow Green Deal and the 9-year mission that it offers as an exciting delivery mechanism to bridge that gap, between our existing ambition and implementation that others have mentioned. Thank you so much, and apologies for taking too long.
Well, thank you very much. You've got a lot of things to say in Glasgow, and the eyes of the world are going to be on how you succeed over the next few years, aren't they, as the result of COP26. So thank you very much indeed. And so now we're going to come back to London, and from the City of London, we've got Gordon Roy, who's District Surveyor and Environmental Resilience Director at the City of London Corporation. Gordon.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm sure if anybody's got their eyes closed, you think I'm going to talk about Glasgow as well, but I'm not. I'm going to talk about the City of London. Unlike some of the other speakers, I don't have an environmental sustainability background. As a district surveyor, I'm very much a building engineering perspective on things. So I've got a slightly different perspective, maybe, or that some of the other speakers might have had. My story will start in 2018, where the Corporation of London came out with its corporate plan to support a thriving community, shape outstanding environments, and contribute to a flourishing society. But it also gave the commitment that we would develop a climate action strategy, not just to mitigate our risk, but to adapt the city with regard to climate change. So what we did in 2019, we took our little team, which dealt with the work under as lead local flood authority, and which looked at flood risks, and we gave them a slightly bigger remit, but to start to look at risks from the changing environment, not just flooding, but other things. At that same time, we found that in 2019, as we've already heard, some cities decided to declare a climate emergency. But being the corporation, we decided not to do that. What we decided to do was we wanted a credible strategy. So we started to look at our current emissions. How can we reduce those emissions? How long is it going to take? But we wanted a realistic timetable. And more importantly, how much was it going to cost us? At the same time, we decided not just to do this, but we brought in the University of Surrey to look at our massive land bank. For those who don't know the City of London, we're the little square mile in the middle, which is the financial centre of the UK. But we have massive amounts of land around Greater London, Epping Forest, Burnham Beaches, and it is a huge land bank, and we do know that it sequestrates a lot of carbon. So we had to calculate that carbon and to see if we could actually improve that at the same time. So following the studies, we came up with our 4 main goals. Oh, sorry, can you change the slide, please? There we go, four main goals. So in 2020, we adopted our climate action strategy. We wanted to be net zero in our operations by 2027, be net zero across the corporation's full value chain by 2040, be net zero in the city by 2040, but also to be climate resilient in our buildings, public spaces and infrastructure. For the first 5 years of that strategy, we've committed £6 to £8 million, of which 15 million is dedicated to climate resilience. Next slide, please. So working with our consultants, we looked at scientific data from to look at weather patterns from Met Office. And what we found with central London is we can expect summer temperatures to rise by about 5 degrees by 2080, winter rainfall increasing by 20%, winter temperatures rising by 3 degrees by 2080. And our heat waves, which we've been getting more and more, but will actually last up to 4 times longer than they currently are. So we identified these 6 main risks to the city. Next slide, please. So again, working with our Bureau Happold, who was our climate resilient partner, we started to look at these risks, and we started to identify a threshold where we felt that things in the city might start to be problematic. So like such as things as temperature rising, where people would feel stressed at around about 35 degrees, road surfaces would start to melt around about 32 degrees. And we came up with 39 actions. Now we've called him the Fergus 39. He was our consultant, so it's you know, we just call them in-house as the Fergus 39. And from those actions, we've developed a number of adaptive pathway approaches, where we've looked at the mitigations that we need to do. We've put timescales, and we've sort of highlighted the main things we need to do by certain times. And we can now prioritize our works now to sort of make sure that we've done these measures before it's critical. Next slide, please. Working with a number of different partners, we've looked at what we need to do, and we've got what we call our resilient measures catalogue. This is developed in conjunction with our open spaces and our public realm teams, where if we've got a scheme coming online, the design team can actually go into this catalogue through a series of drop-down boxes. It will determine or give them information about mitigation measures that they might want to consider, how good it might be in their design, how much it might cost. So it gives designers a catalogue that they can look to see whether or not any mitigation measures might be appropriate for their schemes. In the same time, through our arboriculturists and our planters, we are looking at producing a planting catalogue, where we're looking at what sort of plants and what sort of trees would be appropriate for the urban environments, particularly here in the city, and making sure that the planting that we are choosing is resilient to both the temperature and extreme weather conditions. And our public realm team are in the process of looking at materials catalogues, making sure that the materials that we're picking can be locally sourced, that if in the right places, they are porous, so it helps with sustainable drainage. And particularly in the urban environment, what we're trying to do is to make sure that materials that we choose, particularly for road surfaces of pavements or buildings, that they can actually, they don't absorb the heat, but maybe they reflect it, so that at night it's not such a warm city. Next slide, please. To do this, we're currently working with a number of partners. We don't think we can actually do this completely on our own. We've brought in the British Geological Survey. We're just about to have a dedicated person from them who's going to be doing surveys of the whole of the city to look to see what's actually under the ground. The city has been built on for over 2,000 years, going back to the Romans. So we have lots of structures under the ground. We have numerous train and tube lines and the utilities. So what they're going to do is they're going to map out what's under the ground, so that when we do come to do mitigation measures, we can pick the best places. So we know where to target our efforts, because some places are just not appropriate for planting trees. We're also looking, we've also brought in the King's College University, so that we've started to put up a number of sensors, monitoring sensors, to check rainfall, temperatures, etc. And this is all in advance of us doing some mitigation measures, so we can actually check how good the measures actually are, to make sure that when we go forward, we're actually putting the right things in the right places. Next slide, please. So we've got, on year one, we have 9 pilot sites where we're going to be trialling some mitigation measures. This is particularly around our cool streets and greening. Other speakers have talked about the greening and the massive effect that greening can actually have, both on society in general for their well-being, but actually to cool the city. So we're looking at, we've taken 9 projects which were already on the drawing board, These are all public realm projects, and we're taking them and we're going to enhance them using our resilience catalogue, and we're putting extra money in to improve the resilience measures. So we're increasing the tree cover, changing the planting so it's more resilient, and we're going to be putting in so we can just monitors to check to see if it's appropriate, so that in year 2 and year 3 we're putting in the right measures. Next slide, please. And finally, you just want to talk about the Riverside Strategy. And this is where we've been looking at other measures, other risks to the city. Certainly with climate change, we are definitely seeing, and it's just been reported in the last few days, is about the melting ice caps, and sea level rises is rising. And the city is adjacent to the Thames, which is tidal, and we are expecting the river to increase in the water level to increase. The Environment Agency about 10 years ago introduced the Thames Estuary 2100 project. We've looked at that, and we need to raise our river defence walls by up to 1 metre by 2100. So we're just about to get approved our Riverside Strategy with a number of interventions timetabled in. Our first target is 2065, and we know that development within the city, it is a 35-year cycle. So the idea is that when the big planning applications come in for along the river wall or along the river, we can start through the planning process, getting the developers to increase the river wall to the appropriate height, or build in measures so they can easily increase the river wall height. This is a big thing for us. It will change the landscape to a slight degree along the river. We've already done a survey, a drone survey, which gave us all the information about the river wall, its position, its construction, and its current levels. So we know how much needs to be increased, where, and where we need to do the interventions. So that's a Riverside Strategy, which is our target to look at the river defence with regard to melting ice caps. The other couple of things I just wanted to pick on is about, some people have mentioned green walls. Green walls in the city, we've got from a green roof perspective, we've got over 70 green roofs in our square mile, and we've introduced a number of green walls. But some people have raised the issue with regard to fire problems. Does a green wall present a fire issue? So through our internal teams, we're looking at that issue. We're looking at information from around the world, particularly Singapore and Hong Kong, and we're going to be producing a strategy on green walls so that one is ecologically good, biodiversity good, but also from a fire issue, it covers that as well. And that will be rolled out across London through the building control team, so that when planning applications come in with green walls, we already know the fire issues, and we've already dealt with them. Next slide, please. And that is a very quick summary of what we're doing in the city.
Great.
Back to you, Peter.
Super. Thank you very much, Gordon, for that. And yeah, the Thames Estuary Strategy is interesting, because I also thought Sonia's talk about the regional adaptation strategy is something that we need a bit more regional planning for this sort of stuff down in the southeast, I think, because we tend to look at London very much separate from the rest of the region. But we've got a few questions in the question box, but I'd just like to start. I was interested, Sam, in your comments about funding, and a number of other people have talked about private sector funding, but is there a role for the PWLB, the Public Works Loan Board here? Because shouldn't they be helping local authorities out in terms of investing in these sorts of very necessary changes?
Yeah, I think there is potentially a role for that for the right projects. I think what we're seeing is we need a mix of public funding, and that could be through the PWLB facility, could be through grant funding, but we will only achieve so much using the public purse, and the opportunity to bring in the expertise, the risk sharing of the private sector. So I think there's it's a function that we're exploring for the public funding side, but I think we still need to bring in and unlock that, as we've seen with the renewable sector, unlock the benefits that bringing in private finance can do as well.
Good. Okay, well, let's go to the questions in the box, because we've just got sort of 10 minutes left. Alice says, a fantastic and inspiring talk from Maria. My question is around the placing value on the natural assets of any given place. That was talked about the Manchester team. So her question is, we cannot exist without thriving ecosystems, as has been illustrated by the Global Weather Systems 2021. How can you as a team move away from a value-based system to one of basic needs, which we do tend to always want to put values to it, but actually there are basic aspects to what we're delivering that make things better. So Maria, since she was congratulating you on your talk, let's start with you.
Thank you, and thank you for that positive feedback. I think we'll see changes coming through with the Environment Bill, local nature recovery strategies, and a different emphasis on biodiversity and biodiversity net gain. So that idea of a site leaving a better legacy for biodiversity than would have existed if there wasn't any development. So they're some of the key themes that we'll need to pick up through our review of the Birmingham Development Plan and really embed within our planning policy, and really look forward to being able to bring some new policies into play that really support the Environment Bill.
And anyone else like to make a comment on Alice's view of moving away from calculating everything we need to do on value? No? Okay, so we've got some specific questions about some of the talks, and on Glasgow, Les says, up to yet, the only appreciable drop has been due to electricity generation and use of an incinerator for district heating. I'm unclear how the more difficult steps are going to occur or what they are over the next 9 years. So Sonia, can you fill Les in a little bit on that?
Yes, thank you, Les. Yes, we appreciate and we recognise that in the climate plan, that a lot of the reductions that we've achieved have been due to low-hanging fruit, so to speak. So the easy wins, the quick wins, and that the tough decisions have to happen in the next 9 years. So I think part of that is our Green Deal and investing and accelerating the action that a lot of the solutions we're already taking is just they need to be scaled up, such as district heating and renewable energy, but also looking at resilience and climate adaptation. So I think we just need the investment to scale those up, but we also need to look at changing our planning regulations and building standards, and those are some of the actions which we plan to take with some support from national legislation we know is coming. One of them is around removing gas boilers altogether from new builds by 2025. So I appreciate we still have to deal with retrofitting, and that's a huge challenge, and that's where we rely on our Green Deal to help us to address that and to fund that. Also, our transport strategy will help us to make, and livable neighbourhoods is where we're relying on, make that modal shift from the private vehicle to better, more reliable, more accessible and affordable public transport, but also more accessible and safer active travel infrastructure for those 3-mile journeys that we have a lot of in the city that could be done by walking or wheeling or cycling if the infrastructure was there and people felt safe using it. Sorry, I probably went on for too long. I hope that answers your question.
No, that's fine. That was an important question to answer. So perhaps Dave, I could come to you with this question. Janet Morris asked, how can we deal with earlier green solutions in buildings that have never worked and need to be updated? Years ago, Southwark Council was very proud in reusing its water in their toilets, but they've never worked. and they still claim this is sustainable, but they're unlikely to invest to update this. Now, I mean, I think that's interesting too. One, there is a symbol of that in Southwark. There's a huge tower with 3 windmills in the top, wind turbines, which have actually never worked, but were a part of the mayor's policy of putting in 20% renewables into each building. But I mean, you talked about the city as a stock of materials and the circular economy. How do you utilize technology and which perhaps hasn't worked, and how do you bring it back into delivering something positive?
I mean, it's a great question, and you're right. I mean, there was a point where you could almost age a building by the technology that was in it in terms of the energy renewable energy is providing, and there was a phase of putting small scale wind turbines on roofs that. But I mean, I suppose the problem is we did get it. We have got into a position where we've, in the past anyway, where we sort of followed fashion and popped on a few things that sound like a good idea. And I think hopefully what we're doing now is trying to be more scientific and engineering based around it, and trying to think how these things will have a long-term future. But I think the point is well made, and I think we do have to be looking forward. And I think what's interesting about things like the circular economy is it's trying to do things like scenario modeling and look forward to how our buildings will need to adapt to the users as well as to the changes in the climate. So I'm hoping that sort of thing will help us to improve that. I mean, going backwards and trying to get, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the reason why the Southwark Council HQ is not water system isn't working. I mean, it's generally a pretty robust technology. It's pretty straightforward technology in that you're taking some water off the roof and shoving it in a tank and pumping it around the building. So there have been examples where they haven't worked, but they are usually because of just something went wrong with the commissioning or something like that. But actually they're, in theory, I mean, and in practice, they're a very practical, sensible technology, and we've got to do a lot more of that stuff.
Well, that's a good message for Janet. You should go to the council and tell them to get a plumber in to sort it out.
I don't know if it's as simple as that, but yeah, that's the theory is it's fine.
Right, now, one for Gordon here. So Brian Whiteley says that NLA, we had a webinar where we had speakers from New York, and they were looking at reducing energy generation from tall buildings via introducing air pumps. So given the City of London's commitment to more tall buildings being developed in future, what measures are you encouraging, like air pumps?
Yeah, so yeah, we are committed to new tall buildings. The tall buildings that are coming in now are, well, you know, every single one is more energy efficient than the next one. So they're using technology as best they can. Certainly within the city, we've got a district heating system, and they're just putting down boreholes now for ground source heat pumps. And certainly some of the big buildings, they will come in due course with ground source heat pumps. Technology with regard to air sourced heat pumps, I'm not sure I didn't get to see the seminar or hear the seminar on Monday. Maybe I should have. Maybe I need to look back at it. But air pumps are technology-wise, I'm not sure if they can actually deal with the big buildings. But certainly we are trying to, through our planning service with the new local plan and the London plan, we are trying to make them as more energy efficient as we physically can or possibly can. They are becoming extremely complex buildings. But yeah, we are looking at reducing energy use in them as much as we physically can.
And Sam, Manchester's got quite a lot of new tall buildings popping up. Anything you're doing to mitigate their impact?
Yes, so we've got a joint development plan in the final throes of consultation at the moment that will help us, I guess, catch up with what London's already done in terms of its policies around net zero new build, and introducing that as a requirement from 2028, I think. And also going faster than government's environment bill on things like biodiversity net gain and green spaces factor, which I know the Greater London Authority has also been pushing. I guess then we're still faced with that challenge of retrofit that we've been talking about, and are doing similar things to Glasgow in terms of understanding our public building retrofit opportunities, particularly focusing on solar PV and how we accelerate air source heat pumps and district heating. But we've got some strengthened policy coming through our joint development plan, which will hopefully be starting to be enforced and in place next year.
Jolly good. Thank you very much. Well, we're getting close to time, so I think we should start to wrap up. But it's interesting, Alice has come back, and she's talked about, as Mark Carney says, we're no longer working with market economies, but with market societies, and that's the way it is. So which I think is a really interesting, important point. And if I can find some way of getting there without making too great an impact on the environment, I really want to go to Bhutan, which has a planning policy which is based on happiness as the major outcome of their planning system, which I think is really innovative and interesting, and quite how they make investment work in Bhutan, I'm not quite sure, but it'd be good to go and find out. But thank you very much indeed, all of you, for your contribution, because we have been setting up our city dialogues internationally and now more frequently within the UK to share what different cities are doing, and it's really fascinating to see what they're doing. I like to think that if someone else is doing it, we can borrow those back in London and tell the mayor he's got to do it. Otherwise, everyone's going to start moving to Birmingham. If Birmingham carry out all their things they're doing, all the young people in London are going to go to Birmingham. So it's really important that we keep up. So I think compare and contrast is really interesting in terms of the policy. So today's been very fascinating. So I'll just say that you can, everybody, download our report on Resilient London and Zero Carbon London, which has got lots of case studies and comparisons that you might find interesting and useful. And I just say to members of the audience that it will be a little poll which will come up on the screen, because it's very helpful if you could fill that in, because it helps us make sure we're providing the right sort of program that people will enjoy and respond to. But thank you again to our speakers very much, and thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of the day. Bye.